If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The story of Bob. I moved into this apartment complex about a year ago, thinking it was a quiet, family-friendly place. At first, everything seemed normal. Neighbors nodded politely, kids played in the courtyard, and the vibe was peaceful. But then there was Bob. He lived a few doors down from me, in a corner unit on the ground floor. At first glance, he seemed like one of those quirky, older guys who kept to himself, but that impression didn't last long. It started with small things. Bob standing by his window, watching the kids play outside for hours, never moving, just staring. I remember thinking, maybe he's just lonely, but the way he looked at them wasn't right. His eyes didn't have the warmth of someone enjoying the sound of kids' laughter. It was calculating, almost predatory. One day, I came home from work to find him standing by the playground. The way he lingered made me uneasy, so I decided to hang back and watch. That's when I saw him approach a boy who couldn't have been older than 8. He knelt down, said something I couldn't hear, and then tried to hand the kid something. Candy, I think. The boy hesitated, but before anything else could happen, one of the parents yelled out, and Bob shuffled off like he'd been caught doing something wrong. The parent walked over to the boy, clearly upset, but they didn't confront Bob. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. That night, I locked my door and triple-checked the windows, even though I wasn't sure why. Bob's presence felt like a storm cloud hanging over the complex. A few weeks later, things escalated. It was around 10 p.m., and I was sitting on my couch when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. That wasn't unusual. People came and went at all hours, but something about these steps felt deliberate. Slow, heavy, like whoever it was wanted to be heard. I muted the TV and waited, heart thumping. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a second, I thought it might be one of my neighbors needing something, but no knock came. Just silence. I tiptoed over and peeked through the peephole, and there he was, Bob. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at my door. His face was blank, almost like he was in a trance. I felt frozen, like if I moved or made a sound, it would trigger something. After what felt like forever, he finally walked away, but I didn't relax until I heard the creak of his door closing down the hall. The next day, I decided to mention it to one of the neighbors, a woman named Clara who had lived there for years. She frowned when I brought up Bob. "You're not the first person to notice weird things about him," she said, glancing around like she didn't want to be overheard. She told me stories about him peeking through windows, following kids to their apartments, and even trying to enter someone's unit once. "We've reported him," she said, "but nothing ever happens. They say he hasn't done anything illegal." Hearing this made my skin crawl. Why hadn't anyone warned me about him before I moved in? Clara said she tried to avoid him and advised me to do the same. But it was hard to ignore someone who seemed so intent on making his presence known. Not long after that, something happened that made it impossible to just avoid Bob. It was late afternoon, and I was working from home when I heard a loud bang. It sounded like it came from the back of the apartment, near the bedroom. My first thought was that maybe something fell, but when I went to check, my stomach dropped. The window was open. I was sure I had locked it earlier. I froze, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed movement outside. Bob was standing in the grass behind the building, staring up at my window. He didn't flinch when I saw him, didn't try to act casual. He just stood there, staring, like he was waiting to see what I would do. My hands were shaking as I slammed the window shut and locked it. I wanted to call the police, but what could I even say? That my creepy neighbor was standing outside? It didn't feel like enough, but deep down, I knew this wasn't innocent. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining Bob sneaking into my apartment. At around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off, but not for long. I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. I shot out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed my phone. I didn't even check the peephole this time. I just yelled, "Who's there?" The rattling stopped immediately, but I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. I called the building manager first thing in the morning, but all they did was promise to look into it. I was furious. How many incidents like this had to happen before someone took action? But more than that, I was terrified. Bob wasn't just a creepy neighbor anymore. He felt like a genuine threat. A couple of days later, I decided to install a cheap security camera by my door. It wasn't much, but at least it would give me some peace of mind. That same night, I got my first recording. At around 1:30 a.m., the motion sensor picked up something. When I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach turned. There was Bob, standing just outside my door again. He wasn't doing anything at first, just staring like before. Then, he leaned in, pressing his ear against the door, like he was trying to hear if I was inside. After a minute, he straightened up and started fiddling with the doorknob. He didn't try to force it open, but he twisted it back and forth for a few seconds before walking away. Watching that video made my skin crawl. I sent it to the building manager, but their response was useless, just more vague promises to handle it. It was clear no one was going to help me. Things came to a head about a week later. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had stepped out to run some errands. When I got back, I noticed something was off right away. My door wasn't fully closed. I knew for a fact I had locked it before leaving, but now it was slightly ajar. My heart started pounding as I slowly pushed it open, half expecting to find Bob inside. The apartment looked normal at first glance, but as I walked through the rooms, I realized things had been moved. Drawers were slightly open, a chair was out of place, and my laptop, which I always left on my desk, was now on the couch. It was like someone had been in there, touching everything but not taking anything. The thought of Bob creeping around my apartment while I wasn't home made me feel sick. I called the police this time, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing they could do. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, just a chilling sense of violation. After the break-in, I started seriously considering moving out, but I couldn't afford to break the lease. Instead, I avoided being home as much as possible and kept my phone on me at all times. But Bob didn't let up. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I saw him at the end of the hallway. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I tried to act like I didn't notice and walked toward the stairwell, but as I turned the corner, I heard him following me. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. I practically ran down the stairs, and when I reached the bottom, I turned to look back. Bob was standing on the landing above, gripping the railing, staring at me with this blank expression that sent chills down my spine. I didn't even take the trash out. I just bolted back to my apartment, locking every possible point of entry. I felt trapped. It was like Bob knew exactly how to push my limits without ever doing something I could report. A few nights later, I woke up to a loud banging sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again, 3 heavy knocks on my door. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and crept toward the peephole. Bob was there, his face inches from the door, but what scared me the most was that he was smiling. Not a normal smile. It was wide, unhinged, like he was enjoying himself. I stood there, frozen, as he knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're in there," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. My blood ran cold. I wanted to call the police, but I was terrified that making any noise would provoke him. After what felt like hours, he finally walked away, but I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping a kitchen knife and jumping at every creak and shadow. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I printed out screenshots from the security footage and brought them to the local police station myself. The officer at the desk seemed sympathetic but kept emphasizing how little they could do without concrete evidence of a crime. "He hasn't hurt you or made explicit threats," they said, like that was supposed to make me feel better. I left the station feeling helpless, but I wasn't ready to give up. I started asking around the building to see if anyone else had similar stories. That's when I learned just how far Bob's behavior went. A family on the first floor told me they caught him peering through their kitchen window one night. Another woman said he followed her teenage daughter home from school and stood outside their door for hours. Everyone had a story, but no one seemed willing to confront him directly. "We're scared," one neighbor admitted. "Who knows what he's capable of?" That evening, something happened that still haunts me. I was sitting in my living room, blinds drawn tight, when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security camera app. Motion detected. My stomach dropped as I opened the app. The live feed showed Bob, standing right outside my door, holding something in his hand, a note. He slipped it under the door and stood there for a moment, like he was waiting for me to react. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until he finally walked away. When I felt it was safe, I carefully opened the door just enough to grab the paper. It was a crudely drawn smiley face with the words, "See you soon," scrawled underneath. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Bob was toying with me, and I had no idea what he would do next. After the note, I decided I couldn't stay another night in that apartment. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend while I figured out what to do. Before leaving, I set the security camera to record continuously, hoping to catch something I could take to the police. The next morning, I checked the footage remotely, and what I saw chilled me to the core. Around 3 a.m., Bob had come back. He stood outside my door for over 20 minutes, just staring at it, motionless. Then, he slowly crouched down, pressing his face against the bottom of the door like he was trying to see inside. I felt sick watching it. At one point, he muttered something under his breath, but the audio was too faint to make out. Eventually, he stood up and walked away, but not before dragging his fingers across the doorframe in a way that felt deliberate. I called the building manager again, sent them the footage, and demanded they take action. Their response? "We'll address it during our next tenant meeting." That was the final straw. I broke my lease and moved out the following week. Losing my deposit felt like a small price to pay for my safety. I haven't seen Bob since, but sometimes I still get that uneasy feeling, like someone's watching me. Every creak in my new apartment makes my heart race, and I can't shake the image of his face staring through the peephole or pressed against the floor. I've heard through other neighbors that he's still there, still wandering the halls at night, still making people's lives miserable. To this day, I don't understand why nothing was ever done about him. Maybe it's because he never crossed that line, never did something they could call a crime. But to me, everything he did felt like a warning, a sign that he was just waiting for the right moment. I'll never forget the fear he instilled in me. Even now, I lock every door, double-check every window, and tell myself it's over. But deep down, I know people like Bob don't just stop. The story of Eric, aka the child biter. When Eric moved into our neighborhood, I didn't think much of it. People come and go all the time, especially in a place like ours where the rent's just low enough to attract a mix of folks. I first saw him unloading boxes from a rusty old van, stringy hair, pale skin, and a nervous energy that made you feel like he was looking over his shoulder more than he needed to. He nodded at me when I walked by, but it wasn't the friendly kind of nod. More like he was acknowledging me because he had to. My wife, Sarah, mentioned later that she'd seen him too and thought he looked off. At the time, I brushed it off, joking that half our neighbors looked off after a rough week. Little did we know how right she was. It wasn't until a few weeks later that people started talking about him. One of the moms from the block, Lisa, brought it up at a barbecue. "You heard about the new guy?" "Eric," she said, keeping her voice low like we were trading state secrets. Someone nodded, and before I could ask, Lisa leaned in and whispered, "He's on some kind of registry. For, you know, kids." I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just a rumor. This neighborhood thrives on gossip, and I've heard everything from alien abductions to secret millionaire drug lords. But Lisa swore she'd looked it up. The next day, curiosity got the best of me, and I checked too. My stomach dropped when I saw his face and the words, "Crimes against children." After seeing Eric's name and photo on that registry, I couldn't shake the unease. I didn't tell Sarah right away because I didn't want to freak her out, but I started watching him more closely. He didn't do much to stand out. He mostly kept to himself, walked to the corner store, and occasionally sat on his porch smoking. But the way he avoided eye contact with people, especially the kids playing in the street, made my skin crawl. It wasn't like he was ignoring them. It was more like he was hyper-aware of them, trying too hard not to look. That kind of deliberate behavior, it just didn't sit right. Things got worse when word spread. Suddenly, everyone in the neighborhood knew. Parents stopped letting their kids play outside. Eric became the topic at every conversation, at the grocery store, outside the school, even during church coffee hour. But it wasn't just whispers anymore. People started staring, some even crossing the street to avoid walking past his house. Then, someone spray-painted "Monster" on his front door one night. Eric scrubbed it off the next morning, but the tension didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Every little thing he did felt amplified, like we were all waiting for him to slip up. And honestly, I hated myself for being part of it, but I couldn't stop. About a month after the graffiti incident, something happened that turned the unease into outright fear. It was a Saturday evening, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet, probably because most parents were keeping their kids indoors since Eric moved in. Sarah and I were watching TV when we heard screaming outside. Not the playful kind of yelling you'd hear from kids, but real, gut-wrenching screaming. I ran to the window and saw Lisa's daughter, Emma, bolting down the street barefoot, her face pale as a ghost. Her mom was chasing after her, yelling her name. I ran outside, and by the time I caught up, Emma was curled up on the sidewalk, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Lisa was trying to calm her down, but all Emma kept saying was, "It was him. He was watching me." Over and over again. My stomach twisted. Lisa asked what she meant, and Emma finally pointed toward Eric's house. "In the window," she sobbed. "He was watching me, and he smiled." That was enough to send chills down my spine, but when Lisa looked at me, her face told me she wasn't just scared, she was furious. "We need to do something," she said through clenched teeth. That night, the neighborhood felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Lisa wasn't the type to let things slide, and by the next morning, she'd rallied a group of neighbors to confront Eric. I wasn't keen on joining. I kept telling Sarah it wasn't our business and that we should just let the authorities handle it. But when you live in a small neighborhood, the pressure to stick together is strong. By noon, there were at least 10 of us standing outside Eric's house, Lisa at the front like some kind of leader. She banged on his door with a force that made me flinch. When Eric finally opened it, he looked terrified. Not angry or defensive, just scared. He kept the door barely cracked, like he knew we weren't there to chat. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaky. Lisa didn't waste time. She lit into him, accusing him of watching Emma and making her afraid to even leave the house. Eric kept denying it, saying he didn't even know what she was talking about. "I wasn't watching anyone," he said, almost pleading. But then Lisa mentioned the registry, out loud, for everyone to hear. You could feel the air change. Some of the men in the group took a step closer to the door, and Eric's face went pale. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't going to end well. As Lisa kept pressing, Eric tried to shut the door, but one of the guys, Dave, shoved his foot in to block it. That's when things started to spiral. Dave's voice was booming, demanding answers, while Lisa yelled over him. Eric backed away into his house, shaking his head and mumbling something I couldn't hear. The whole scene felt wrong, like we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Sarah grabbed my arm, whispering that we should leave, but I couldn't move. It was like my legs were rooted to the spot. And then, out of nowhere, Eric screamed. Not words, just a guttural, animalistic scream that froze everyone in place. He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled, and for a few seconds, the street went dead silent. Then, as if on cue, the porch light flickered and went out. Lisa and Dave stood there stunned, and no one said a word. Finally, someone muttered, "We should call the cops," but even that didn't break the tension. Slowly, people started to back away, murmuring excuses to leave. I glanced at Eric's darkened window one last time before Sarah dragged me home, and I swear, for just a split second, I thought I saw someone, or something, moving behind the curtain. That night, sleep was impossible. Every little creak of the house or gust of wind outside had me on edge. Sarah fell asleep eventually, but I just lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water, hoping it would calm me down. As I stood at the kitchen sink, I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw him, Eric, standing in his front yard. At first, I thought he was just staring at his house, but then I realized he wasn't looking at anything. He was just standing there, completely still. I should have turned away, gone back to bed, but I couldn't. Something about the way he stood, it wasn't normal. His head was tilted slightly, and his arms hung awkwardly at his sides, like a puppet with its strings cut. And then, without warning, he turned and looked straight at me. Even from across the street, I could feel his eyes on me. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, I blinked, and when I looked back, he was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just gone. The next morning, everyone seemed on edge. Word about Eric standing outside must have spread because people were quieter than usual, avoiding his house entirely. Even the kids, who usually didn't notice much of anything, were keeping close to their parents. Sarah asked me about the noise she heard last night. She said she thought she'd heard footsteps outside our window, but I brushed it off, not wanting to add to her worry. Deep down, though, I couldn't shake the image of Eric staring at me, his face blank, almost lifeless. By late afternoon, Lisa came by, her face tight with anger and fear. "Emma won't leave her room," she said, her voice breaking. She said she saw him again, last night, outside her window. My heart sank. Emma's bedroom faced the backyard, nowhere near Eric's house. There was no reason for him to be back there, but Lisa swore Emma wasn't lying. She said he just stood there, smiling. Lisa's hands were shaking as she spoke, and for the first time, I realized just how terrified she was, not just for her daughter, but for all of us. I wanted to tell her it was probably a misunderstanding, but after last night, I couldn't. Something was wrong with Eric, and none of us knew what to do about it. By evening, tensions hit a boiling point. Lisa had called a neighborhood meeting in her driveway, and almost everyone showed up. People were angry, scared, and desperate for answers. Some wanted to call the cops again. Others talked about forming some kind of watch group to keep an eye on Eric. But the scariest part was the silence from the few neighbors who'd actually confronted him the day before. Dave, usually the loudest guy on the block, just stood there with his arms crossed, staring at the ground. When someone asked him what he thought, he muttered, "I'm done with it," and walked away without another word. That should have been the end of it for the night, but around 9 p.m., the power went out. Not just for one house, but the whole block. It was the middle of winter, so the darkness felt thicker, heavier than usual. People started coming out onto their porches with flashlights and phones, trying to figure out what was going on. I grabbed a lantern and went outside, but before I could say anything to my neighbors, a shrill, panicked scream ripped through the air. It was Lisa. She was standing in the middle of the street, pointing toward Eric's house. "He's watching us," she screamed. "He's in the window." All the flashlights immediately turned toward Eric's house. At first, I couldn't see anything. It was just darkness behind the windows. But then, in the faint glow of someone's lantern, I saw it. Eric was standing there, his face barely visible through the glass, his body still as a statue. The way his head was tilted made it look like he was studying us, almost amused. My stomach turned. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the way he didn't flinch or move, even with a dozen lights pointed at him. It felt like he wanted us to see him. Someone yelled, "Get out here, you sick bastard," and a few others joined in, shouting for him to explain himself. But Eric didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, the window slammed shut so hard it rattled the entire house. The sound was so sudden and violent that everyone jumped, and the screaming stopped immediately. The street fell into an eerie silence, the kind where you could hear every breath, every shuffle of feet. That's when the first flashlight flickered out. Then another. One by one, every light in the street started dying until we were left in complete darkness. In the pitch-black silence, all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and ragged. Then, from somewhere in the dark, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and crunching against the gravel. They weren't coming from Eric's house. They were closer, somewhere in the street with us. "Who's there?" someone called out, their voice trembling. No one answered. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. I held Sarah's hand tightly, trying to convince myself it was just another neighbor moving around. Then came the laughter. Low and guttural, like it was being forced out of someone who didn't quite know how to laugh. It echoed through the street, bouncing off the houses, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Sarah clutched my arm, and I could feel her nails digging into my skin. "Let's go back inside," she whispered, but I couldn't move. I wasn't sure what I was more afraid of, staying there in the dark or turning my back on whatever was out there. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving the night eerily quiet again. Someone, a man I didn't recognize, shouted, "Enough of this," and charged toward Eric's house. His flashlight beam bobbed wildly as he moved, and I wanted to yell for him to stop, but my voice caught in my throat. The light hit Eric's porch, then the door. He started pounding on it, yelling for Eric to come out. For a second, I thought nothing would happen. And then the door creaked open. Just a crack. What happened next is burned into my mind like a bad dream. The man leaned forward, trying to peer inside, when suddenly he was yanked off his feet. It was so fast I barely saw it. Just a blur of motion and the sound of him screaming, his flashlight hitting the ground and spinning in circles. By the time we all ran toward him, he was gone. The door slammed shut again, and there was no sign of him, no sound except the faint whirring of his flashlight as it rolled to a stop. No one dared get closer to the house. We just stood there, staring at the porch, paralyzed by fear. No one said a word after that. We just backed away, slowly, like we thought any sudden movement might draw whatever had taken that man out of the house. Someone whispered, "Call the cops," but nobody moved to do it. Maybe we were too scared, or maybe we all knew, deep down, that no cop showing up here was going to fix this. Sarah tugged on my arm, whispering again that we needed to go home, and this time, I listened. We stumbled back inside, locking every door and window we could, though it felt pointless. The night dragged on, and I don't think I blinked once. I just sat in the living room, staring out the window, trying to catch any movement in the shadows. But there was nothing, just silence and darkness. Then, at exactly 3:15 a.m., our power came back on. The sudden hum of the fridge and the flicker of lights startled me so badly I nearly fell off the couch. I ran to the window to see if the rest of the neighborhood had power too. Most of the houses were still dark, but Eric's house was lit up, every single window glowing with an unnatural, almost blinding white light. And in one of those windows, just for a split second, I swear I saw him again, smiling. By morning, it was like the whole neighborhood had collectively decided not to talk about what happened. The police eventually came after someone reported the missing man, but they didn't seem too interested. They knocked on Eric's door, but no one answered, and when they tried to investigate further, they said the house was empty. That word stuck with me. Empty. How could it be empty? I'd seen him in the window. We'd all seen him. Over the next few days, Eric's house stayed eerily quiet. No lights, no movement. The for rent sign that had been there before he moved in suddenly reappeared on the lawn, like nothing had ever happened. Families started to leave. Lisa packed up and moved within the week, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. But the strangest thing, no one ever talked about Eric again. It was like the entire neighborhood had decided to erase him, the incident, everything. Even now, years later, I don't know what we saw that night or what Eric really was. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laughter, low and guttural, echoing in my head. The story of Savannah. Back in the summer of 2018, I was living in this small suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't the kind of place where anything really exciting happened. Just rows of identical houses, cul-de-sacs, and families who spent most evenings grilling in their backyards. I was 24 at the time, freshly out of college, and renting a little two-bedroom house with my best friend, Jenna. Life was simple, predictable even, and that's exactly how I liked it. But then Savannah moved in next door, and everything turned upside down. Savannah was in her early 30s and had this energy about her that made her hard to ignore. She was petite but carried herself like someone twice her size, always wearing these flowing skirts and chunky rings that looked like they belonged to a fortune teller. She introduced herself the day she moved in, standing on our porch with a plate of homemade cookies and an aura of confidence that felt almost theatrical. At first, I thought she was just eccentric. She talked a mile a minute about her love for tarot cards, ghost hunting shows, and her firm belief that spirits were everywhere. Jenna and I exchanged amused glances when Savannah told us she'd already cleansed her house with sage because the energy felt off. It was quirky, harmless fun, or so I thought. At first, Savannah was just that quirky neighbor everyone humors but secretly finds a bit odd. She'd show up unannounced at our door with random gifts. Candles, crystals, even a little jar of salt she swore would protect our home. She talked endlessly about how the neighborhood was built on tainted land, and claimed to sense restless spirits everywhere. I won't lie, I kind of enjoyed her stories in the beginning. They were dramatic, spooky, and a little entertaining after a long day at work. Jenna, though, found her exhausting. She's like a walking episode of Ghost Hunters, she'd joke. But Savannah was persistent, and before long, she wormed her way into our lives. Things started getting strange when Savannah got her hands on a Ouija board. She called it a spiritual tool, not a toy, and insisted it was the key to understanding the energy in our neighborhood. One evening, she invited Jenna and me over for what she called a connection session. Jenna refused, saying she wasn't about to summon demons in a suburban living room, but I was curious. I joined Savannah in her dimly lit house, where she'd set the mood with flickering candles and some sort of herbal incense that burned my throat. The session was weird, to say the least. Savannah's fingers danced over the planchette with an intensity that felt almost theatrical, spelling out nonsense names like Milo and Brenna that she claimed were spirits trying to communicate. I wasn't convinced, but Savannah looked so utterly serious, I didn't have the heart to call her out. Over the next few weeks, Savannah became obsessed with her Ouija board. She'd corner me every chance she got, breathlessly recounting the messages she'd received from her sessions. The spirits, she said, were becoming clearer. Milo, according to her, was an old farmer who had died violently on this very land, and Brenna was a child who had been trapped here for over a century. Savannah spoke about them like they were her friends, like they were real. It was unsettling, but I didn't take her too seriously until she started insisting the spirits were aware of me, too. Milo says you have a strong energy, she told me one day, her eyes gleaming. He wants to connect with you. I tried brushing it off, but Savannah's persistence grew suffocating. She started leaving cryptic notes in my mailbox, slips of paper with phrases like, "He's waiting for you," or "The veil is thinning." Jenna was livid, calling Savannah a lunatic, and urged me to set some boundaries. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that ignoring Savannah might only make things worse. Then came the night that pushed everything over the edge. Savannah knocked on our door just past midnight, clutching her Ouija board like it was a lifeline. She was frantic, her hair wild, and her eyes bloodshot. "Milo's angry," she whispered. "He says something bad is coming. You have to help me calm him." Jenna refused to let Savannah in, but I stepped onto the porch to talk to her, mostly out of a mix of guilt and unease. The night air was heavy, and Savannah kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone, or something, to appear out of the darkness. "You don't understand," she hissed, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. "Milo said there's something wrong in your house. Something dark." Her intensity rattled me, but I told her firmly that it was late, and we'd talk in the morning. She left reluctantly, muttering about how I'd regret ignoring her. I went to bed that night feeling shaken but determined to distance myself from her drama. The next morning, I woke up to find strange symbols scrawled in chalk all over our driveway and front door. Jenna was furious, certain Savannah was behind it, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Part of me was scared she'd spiral even further if I did. Instead, we scrubbed the symbols off and decided to avoid her as much as possible. For a while, it seemed like she got the message. She stopped coming over, and the bizarre notes in the mailbox stopped, too. I thought maybe things were finally settling down. But then, one evening, Jenna came home pale and shaking. She said she'd seen Savannah in her backyard, digging furiously in the dirt under a tree. "She's lost it," Jenna said. "I'm calling the police." The police showed up about an hour later. Jenna and I watched from the living room window as two officers knocked on Savannah's door. She answered with a calmness that felt almost chilling, as if she had been expecting them. After a brief conversation, they walked around to the backyard with her. I couldn't hear what was being said, but the officer's body language shifted from professional to uneasy as Savannah gestured animatedly at the hole she'd been digging. Eventually, they left without taking her in, but one of the officers gave us a knowing look as he passed our house, like he was silently agreeing she wasn't quite right. That night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze in bed, straining to hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window, my hands shaking. Pulling the curtain back just a fraction, I caught a glimpse of Savannah standing in the darkness, her face inches from the glass, illuminated by the faint glow of her porch light. She was smiling, but her eyes were wide and unblinking. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my chest, and called Jenna's name. By the time Jenna came rushing in, Savannah was gone. That's it, Jenna said, grabbing her keys. We're staying at my mom's tonight. We spent the night at Jenna's mom's house, but neither of us got much sleep. The next morning, I checked my phone and saw several missed calls from an unknown number. I didn't think much of it until we returned home later that afternoon. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt my stomach drop. Our front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Jenna parked the car but told me to wait while she checked things out. Moments later, she came rushing back, her face pale. "It's Savannah," she whispered. "She's inside." We called the police immediately, and within minutes, 2 squad cars pulled up. The officers entered the house cautiously while Jenna and I stood frozen in the yard. I don't think I took a single breath until they escorted Savannah out in handcuffs. She looked disheveled, her hair matted and her clothes streaked with dirt. But what truly unnerved me was how calm she seemed. As they loaded her into the back of the car, she turned to me with that same wide-eyed smile. "You didn't listen," she said softly. "He's still angry." The police found strange things inside the house. Burnt candles, piles of dirt scattered in a circle on our living room floor, and torn pages from what looked like an old diary. One officer told us Savannah had been performing some sort of ritual, though he didn't elaborate. They suggested we stay somewhere else for a few days, just to let things settle, and honestly, we didn't argue. Jenna called her mom again, and we packed bags like our lives depended on it. As we left, I couldn't help but feel like Savannah's parting words were echoing in my head. "He's still angry." The next few nights were uneventful, and I began to convince myself it was all over. Savannah was in custody, her bizarre behavior explained away as a mental health crisis. But then something happened that I still can't explain. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly against wood. It wasn't coming from inside the room. It was under the bed. My chest tightened as I sat frozen in the dark, straining to hear. Jenna stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep, but the sound was so faint I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. I must have sat there for 20 minutes, barely breathing, listening to that faint, deliberate scratching. Finally, I worked up the courage to grab my phone and turn on the flashlight. My hands were trembling so badly that the light wobbled across the room as I leaned over the edge of the bed. Slowly, I lowered the beam toward the floor, half expecting to see Savannah herself crammed underneath, grinning up at me. But when the light hit the space under the bed, there was nothing there, just the hardwood floor and a few forgotten socks. The scratching stopped the moment the light hit, leaving the room unnervingly silent. The next morning, I told Jenna what had happened. She laughed it off, calling it a stress dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. Things only got stranger from there. Small objects started disappearing. My car keys, a pair of earrings, even my favorite coffee mug. At first, I thought I was just being careless, but then I found them all in the same place, piled neatly in the corner of my closet. That was the moment I started to wonder if Savannah had been right all along. What if she hadn't been summoning something? What if she'd been trying to contain it? I tried to convince Jenna that something wasn't right, but she wouldn't hear it. "Savannah got into your head," she said, shaking her head. "She's gone now, and we need to move on." I wanted to believe her, but the unease followed me everywhere. The house felt different. Heavier, colder, like the air itself was pressing down on me. And then, one night, I saw it. I had gotten up to grab a glass of water and was halfway down the hallway when I felt it, this awful, prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned slowly, and there it was. It was just a shadow at first, slinking along the far wall of the living room, darker than the night around it. But then it moved, stepping out from the corner like it had been waiting for me to notice. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural, and though it didn't have a face, I felt its gaze boring into me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, paralyzed, as it tilted its head like it was curious, then slowly began to advance. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. Somehow, I managed to stumble back into my room and slam the door. The second I locked it, the shadow vanished, and the house went still. The next morning, I couldn't keep quiet about what I'd seen. I told Jenna everything. The shadow, the feeling of being watched, even the strange noises I'd been hearing at night. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're just sleep-deprived," she said, her tone dismissive. "We've been through a lot, and your brain is playing tricks on you." But I knew what I'd seen. The shadow was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just lingering in the house. It was attached to me. Savannah's words came rushing back. "He's angry." That evening, Jenna left to spend the night with her boyfriend, leaving me alone in the house for the first time since everything began. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every little sound made my heart race. Around midnight, the power went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. That's when I heard it again. The scratching. This time, it was louder, coming from the walls and the ceiling, like it was surrounding me. I grabbed a flashlight and bolted to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock twisted and turned, but the door wouldn't open, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I started to panic, screaming at the top of my lungs for help, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. My panic hit its peak when I felt the temperature in the room drop. The air became icy, and my breath came out in shaky white puffs. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the dark, but I couldn't see anything. Then, in the corner of the living room, the shadow emerged again, slowly unfurling itself like it had been crouched there, waiting. It was larger this time, its limbs impossibly long, reaching toward the ceiling. My knees buckled as it began to glide toward me, silent but purposeful. In that moment, I remembered something Savannah had said during one of her frantic rants. "Salt," she'd whispered. "It's the only way to keep it at bay." I didn't even know if it would work, but I sprinted to the kitchen, grabbing the jar of salt Savannah had left on our doorstep weeks ago. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it, but I managed to fling a handful in the direction of the shadow. The second the salt hit the floor, the shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame before retreating into the walls. The growling stopped, and the air seemed to lift slightly. I stood there, clutching the jar, tears streaming down my face, too afraid to move. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, I didn't dare. I kept the jar of salt clutched in my hands, sitting on the couch with every light in the house turned on. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the windows, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like the house itself was breathing again. But I knew I couldn't stay there another night. Whatever Savannah had unleashed wasn't gone, it was waiting. I called Jenna and told her everything, sparing no detail this time. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or dismiss me. "I knew something was off with Savannah," she admitted. "We need to figure out how to get rid of this thing. For good." That afternoon, we packed up and drove to the library, poring over books on folklore and supernatural entities. One thing kept coming up, a cleansing ritual. It wasn't exactly a solution, but it was the only lead we had. We gathered the supplies, sage, more salt, and a white candle, and prepared to perform the ritual that evening. I was terrified, but I couldn't keep living in fear. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the kitchen, salt jar in hand, with every light in the house turned on as soon as the power came back. By the time Jenna returned the next morning, I was a wreck, red-eyed, trembling, and still clutching the jar like it was the only thing keeping me alive. She took one look at me and knew something had happened. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "No arguments, no questions." She packed a bag for me while I called a locksmith to change the locks on the front door. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the locks that needed changing. Whatever was in the house, it wouldn't be stopped by a deadbolt. We stayed at a hotel that night, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a faint sense of safety. But just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and it simply read, "He's still there. Be careful." My stomach dropped. I didn't need to ask who it was from. Savannah. How she'd managed to contact me, I didn't know, but her warning sent chills down my spine. It was the last straw. The next day, Jenna and I packed up the house and moved out. I didn't care about the deposit or the furniture we left behind. I just wanted to be gone. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again, or as close to normal as it could get. Jenna and I moved into a new apartment across town, and I threw myself into work, trying to forget everything that had happened. Savannah never contacted me again, and as far as I knew, she was still in custody or under psychiatric care. But every now and then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I could hear faint scratching. I told myself it was just my imagination, residual fear from everything I'd been through. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The final twist came a year later. I was scrolling through local news articles when I stumbled across a headline that stopped me cold. Body discovered in backyard of Columbus suburban home. My stomach churned as I clicked on the article. The address was Savannah's old house. The body was that of a man, identified as a farmer who had gone missing in the 1930s. The police said it appeared he had been buried hastily, but his cause of death was still unknown. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. Milo. Savannah had been digging in that exact spot the night Jenna saw her. She had been right about him all along. The paranormal encounters with Savannah and Autumn. I don't even know where to start because this whole thing still feels unreal to me, like some twisted dream I can't wake up from. It all began when Savannah, my coworker, started getting really into the paranormal. At first, it was harmless. She'd talk about ghost hunting shows, or she'd bring up creepy local legends during our lunch breaks. But over time, it got darker. She started saying things like she could sense spirits or feel when something off was around. I tried to brush it off as just her being eccentric, but it wasn't long before she introduced me to Autumn. And that's when everything took a turn I wasn't ready for. Autumn was different. She wasn't bubbly or curious about the supernatural like Savannah. She was intense. The first time I met her, she just stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time, like she was sizing me up. She didn't smile, didn't say much at all, just hung around Savannah like a shadow. But what really creeped me out was how Savannah suddenly started acting like Autumn was some kind of expert on the supernatural. "Autumn's been through things," Savannah told me one day, her voice low and serious. "She knows what's out there." After that, it was like they had their own little world that no one else was allowed into, full of secret rituals and whispered stories that always seemed to end with, "You wouldn't understand." Things got weird fast. Savannah and Autumn started meeting up after work, and they'd come back the next day with these cryptic conversations that didn't make sense to anyone but them. They talked about proving something to the world, like they had discovered some hidden truth. One day, Savannah showed up with this bracelet made of twisted black string and little bones. She said Autumn had made it for her as protection. I laughed nervously, thinking it was just one of their quirks, but Savannah looked me dead in the eye and said, "You'd need it too if you knew what was coming." It sent a chill through me, the kind that makes your stomach twist without knowing why. Then the notes started showing up. At first, it was just random scraps of paper left on people's desks at work. Symbols, weird phrases and languages none of us recognized. Everyone thought it was a prank, but then someone pointed out that these things only appeared when Savannah and Autumn were around. One morning, I found one tucked under my keyboard. It was a triangle with an eye in the center, surrounded by words I couldn't read. But it wasn't just the note, it was how cold the paper felt, like it had been left outside in freezing weather, even though the office was warm. I threw it away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Things escalated when Savannah and Autumn began talking about a rift they'd found, some kind of place where, according to them, the barrier between our world and whatever's out there was thin. Savannah became obsessed, saying they had to protect it or use it before someone else did. She'd bring in these books, old, dusty things with yellowed pages, and show them to Autumn during breaks. Once, I caught a glimpse of one, and I swear the illustrations looked like they were drawn in blood. When I asked Savannah about it, she just smiled and said, "It's not something you should worry about." Yet, that word, yet, stuck with me. It was like she was warning me, or worse, preparing me. A week later, there was an incident. Savannah convinced a small group of us to go out to an abandoned building on the edge of town. She said it was for a team-building exercise, but Autumn was there too, which already made it feel off. The place was eerie, broken windows, graffiti everywhere, and this strange smell, like wet earth and rot. Savannah led us to a room in the center of the building where candles were already set up, as if someone had been there before us. She handed each of us a small, smooth stone and told us to stand in a circle. "It's harmless," she said, but her tone was too eager, like she was desperate for us to believe her. I didn't even realize how much I was shaking until the candlelight flickered against the stone in my hand. The air in that room felt wrong, like it was pressing down on us. Autumn stood silently in the corner, watching us with this unsettling intensity. Savannah started chanting something under her breath, words I didn't recognize but felt instinctively were not meant to be spoken. The room grew colder with every syllable, and the candle flames flickered wildly, even though there was no wind. I remember feeling this strange vibration in the stone I was holding, like it was alive. I wanted to leave, but Savannah's voice kept growing louder, almost hypnotic. I glanced at the others, and I could tell they felt it too, this pull, like something was keeping us there. Then, without warning, the candle closest to me went out, plunging part of the room into darkness. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. A shape, darker than the shadows, moving along the edges of the circle. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Someone else gasped, and I realized I wasn't the only one who saw it. "Don't move," Savannah hissed, breaking her chant. Her voice sounded panicked for the first time. That's when Autumn stepped forward. Her eyes locked on the same spot where the shadow had been. She didn't look scared, she looked fascinated. "It's here," she whispered, and I swear her voice didn't sound human. The moment Autumn said that, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just cold anymore, it felt alive, like the walls were breathing. One of the others, a guy named Alex, dropped his stone and bolted for the door. The second he stepped out of the circle, there was this deafening noise, like metal grinding against metal, and the candles all blew out at once. Total darkness. Someone screamed. Maybe it was me, I honestly don't know, but in that pitch-black room, I swear I could feel something moving. Not just around us, but between us, like it was weaving through the group, brushing against our skin. Then there was this awful smell, like burning hair and decay. My eyes started to adjust to the dark, and I could make out shapes, shadows that didn't belong to any of us, darting along the walls. I felt something touch my arm, icy and sharp, and I yanked away, nearly dropping my stone. "Stay in the circle," Savannah yelled, her voice trembling. That's when I realized she wasn't in control anymore. Whatever she and Autumn had called, it was beyond them now. Autumn just stood there, smiling, like she'd been waiting for this. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and I wanted to shake her, scream at her to make it stop, but I couldn't move. None of us could. I don't know how long we were stuck like that. Seconds, minutes? It felt like an eternity. The grinding noise faded, replaced by this low, guttural sound, like something breathing from deep underground. I was clutching the stone so hard it felt like it might shatter in my hand. Savannah was muttering under her breath again, this time almost frantic, like she was trying to undo whatever she'd started. But Autumn? She stepped out of the circle. I couldn't believe it. She walked straight toward the darkest corner of the room, her hand outstretched like she was reaching for something. "Don't!" Savannah screamed, her voice breaking, but Autumn didn't even flinch. The second Autumn crossed the edge of the circle, the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. Then she stopped, standing completely still, her hand frozen mid-reach. For a moment, everything was silent. No grinding, no breathing, just this unbearable quiet. And then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a scared one, but this low, throaty chuckle that made my stomach turn. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice echoing in a way that didn't make sense, like it was coming from everywhere at once. Before anyone could react, the shadows behind her seemed to ripple and expand, swallowing her whole. 1 second she was there, and the next, she was just gone. The second Autumn vanished. Chaos broke loose. Savannah dropped to her knees, screaming her name over and over, but the rest of us couldn't even move. The shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, almost suffocating, and that low, guttural sound came back, louder this time, vibrating through the floor. I could feel it in my chest, like my rib cage was going to snap. Alex, who was still by the door, tried to call out, but his voice came out strangled, like something was choking him. I remember thinking, this is it. We're all going to die here. And then, just like that, it stopped. The air cleared, the shadows receded, and the candles flared back to life, their flames steady as if nothing had happened. Autumn was gone. Completely. Savannah sat there, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared, her face pale and blank like her mind had just shut down. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We all just stood there, frozen, trying to process what we'd just seen. Eventually, Alex stumbled out, and one by one, we followed. Savannah stayed behind, muttering to herself. I don't know how long she stayed in that building, and honestly, I don't want to know. The walk back to the car was dead silent. No one said a word, not even Alex, who usually cracked jokes when things got tense. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us or feel that awful cold again, but it was just the night, still and too quiet. When we finally got to the car, I realized I was still holding the stone Savannah had given me. I threw it into the bushes without thinking, like getting rid of it would erase what just happened. It didn't. None of us knew what to say, so we just drove back, each of us staring out the windows, lost in our own heads. I haven't seen Savannah since that night. She didn't show up to work the next day, and a few days later, I heard she'd quit without warning. Autumn. It's like she never existed. No one's heard from her or found any trace of her. I tried to explain what happened to someone once, but the words didn't come out right. How do you tell someone that you watched a person vanish into thin air, swallowed by something you can't even describe? Sometimes late at night, I think I hear that grinding noise again, faint and far away, and I can't help but wonder, did Autumn really disappear, or is she still out there somewhere, waiting for whatever it was to come back?